Hello and welcome to Stuff That Interests Me with me, Dominic Frisby. And today I'm sitting with a man who I have literally met 5 minutes ago. He knocked on my door, he came in, I gave him a cup of tea, and now we are sitting down to interview. We have never spoken before. That man is Paul Kingsnorth. He's the author of 6 books. He lives in rural Ireland, and he was passing through London, and I said to Paul, if you're ever passing through London, drop me a line. And he dropped me a line 2 or 3 days ago and said, I'm passing through London, and hence we have this interview. Now, I say I've met Paul 10 minutes ago, but I've known about him and he's known about me for a long time. We both published books a long time ago with Unbound, and Paul's book, The Wake, which was about underground resistance in England shortly after the Norman Conquest, was longlisted for the Booker Prize. And it was as a result of reading an article that Paul had written in The Guardian about land ownership since the days of the Norman Conquest, land ownership in the UK. That's when I kind of became very interested in meeting Paul and when I started emailing him. Now, as those of you that know me, I started out my life quite left-wing in my 20s, as a student in my 20s, and then I started reading about money and taxes, and I became very disillusioned with the way that the West is run with our authorities, and I became more and more libertarian, and some people call that right-wing. But anyway, I've become almost an anarchist, if you like, in that I believe in as little government as possible. But I've arrived at those conclusions through a very financial route, a financial and economic route. Now, Paul, the man sitting opposite me, I suspect has arrived at similar anarchic conclusions. He is similarly disillusioned with our authorities. However, he has arrived at the same destination, but through a rather different left-wing environmentalist journey. I think it's fair to say that. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think it is fair to say. If we're talking about small states and local power and devolved democracy and all these kind of things, these are things actually that have been at the heart of radical green thinking for the last 40 years, actually, and that's kind of where I've come at them from. And I suppose listening to you talking about your journey is quite interesting, because when I was a student, I was similarly, I suppose, part of the sort of liberal left. You know, you tend to be quite supportive of big state initiatives and welfare and government help. And in my case, as someone who was an environmentalist or campaigner, you tend to look to governments as the solution to many of the problems. If you've got to deal with climate change, you say that that's a problem that only governments can deal with. But the more you look into it, the more you come to a conclusion, which was summed up brilliantly by Leopold Kohr about 40 years ago, a classic green thinker who wrote a book called The Breakdown of Nations, which if you haven't read it, it sounds like you probably enjoy it. And he said, wherever something is wrong, something is too big.
Nice, love it.
It's very good. I mean, he's actually trying to make a case for small nations, and what he does is he takes a whistle-stop tour through history, and he says most of the great cultural achievements of human history have actually come from very small nations, or even tribal peoples. And as soon as big empires and enormous governments start to spread out across the land, culture and economics and democracy and governance, people being able to govern themselves, all suffer.
I rabbited on about in my book Life After the State about just this thing, and the ideal example is the Italian city-states, one of the greatest contributors to, and the ancient Greek city-states as well, one of the greatest contributors to mankind, invention, art, all these kind of things.
Yeah, I mean, the classic green text is Small is Beautiful by E.F. Schumacher, which is an economics text, but it's also a political text, and it's the same thing, it's the same notion. There's all sorts of interesting psychological studies that have been done on the fact that humans operate best within as self-organising groups of below 100 people. It's pretty clear that once democracy gets beyond a certain stage, it's not really a democracy. It's what we have in this country, which is an elected oligarchy, where once every 5 years you can vote for one of two groups of corporate stooges who will then run the global economy for you. So
I'm guessing then that, I'm not sure if you did vote, but would you have voted Brexit?
I did. Yeah, I voted to leave the EU, which has got me some heat from other environmentalists. But I mean, I've written a fair bit about this since that happened, because I didn't say anything in the run-up to the election. I didn't really want to get involved in all the fighting. I didn't write anything about it. I just voted to leave because I think small is beautiful, and I think people should have sovereignty. And much as I like feeling European and I like cooperation with other nations, I don't like being run by a superstate.
Love Europe, hate the EU.
Well, they're not the same thing, much as some people would like to tell us otherwise. And so I did vote to leave. If I look at the world, it looks to me like, if you're looking at the environmental crisis, which is also a crisis of democracy and society, I think you've got hugely top-heavy states, and you've also got hugely top-heavy corporations and financial institutions, actually, and they've all got far too much power. They're all effectively serving each other's interests. The state now really just seems to effectively act as a service industry for whatever the corporate economy wants to do. And the lack of power that people feel and their kind of deracination from that giant machine, I think is one of the reasons we're currently getting this kind of explosion of populism around the world, because people just feel completely, absolutely ignored and cut off. And
people call it a failure of capitalism. I call it exactly what you described, crony capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, it is really. It's also a failure of democracy. I mean, it's a failure of states. What's interesting at the moment with what's happened with Trump and what's happening in Europe with Marine Le Pen today, there's the French election going on, but also what's happened with the election of, say, Jeremy Corbyn as leader of Labour and Bernie Sanders over there. So it's happening on the...
And Beppe Grillo in Italy and Podesta.
Across the spectrum, you've got all of these candidates coming along who are saying now, we're speaking for the people against the elites. Whether they are or not is another matter, but the fact that they can get so much traction saying that is because a lot of people feel like they're entirely ignored, clearly, by political and economic elites, which largely they have been. Because we're just coming out of a 20-year period in which politics was all effectively managerial neoliberalism, where the right and the left had become more or less the same thing. Everyone had become very Blairite and Clintonite in the middle of the road, and they'd all made their peace with crony capitalism, as you called it, and said this is the only game in town. There was no choice politically, and at the moment that's all breaking down again and getting quite interesting and slightly disturbing as well.
And yes, but thank goodness it's breaking down.
Well, it needs to break down, yeah, and a lot of people who were invested in the previous 20 years of arrangements, I suppose, are getting very anxious about it. But it was going to happen. It was always going to hit the wall because it was fundamentally unsustainable, I think.
Listening to you talk, I've got about 1 million things I want to ask you to talk about. I'm having to hold myself back and remember I'm an interviewer and to let you speak. But here's the first question I wonder. Why is, going back to what you said about small is beautiful, and that being the kind of ethos of things green, and there's much less waste, and let's face it, waste is one of the biggest problems as far as environmental destruction is concerned. It's just the sheer waste. Is better in a small environment. Why is the Green Party, why does it tend to be so authoritarian and the government has the answers and regulatory? Well, why isn't it much more laissez-faire?
That is a very interesting question, and I think when the Green Party started out 40 years ago, it was much more cross-political almost. I mean, there were people from all political trends in the Green Party. There were people from the left, there were people from the kind of conservative right, there were anarchists, there were all sorts of people in there. Today the Green Party is largely a very middle-class, liberal left party. I mean, I think a lot of this comes down to class, actually. I mean, the sort of class politics of the middle-class left, as you see it in Labour and as you see it in the Liberal Democrats and as you see it in the Greens, it's very much social democracy. It's very much the notion that the state we must have a state that works for us, and a state that we can control. So even though in theory the Green Party is committed to localisation, in reality they're not terribly interested in actually breaking down power systems and taking things down to a lower level. I mean, it might also be just, politics. It might also be impossible to push a political line that's radical enough in that sense. But I get the sense that the Greens have been hijacked by a sort of globalist middle class for whom actually small might be beautiful in theory, but big is best in practice. And so that's kind of where you find yourself. I mean, the thing about one of the major issues for me in terms of the environmental crisis is that because all the systems that we live under are so big, we don't see the consequences of our actions. So we can go to the shops and we can buy some meat or some eggs or a t-shirt or anything at all. We've got no idea where it came from or how it was produced, what conditions it was produced in. Then we chuck the rubbish away. We've got no idea how it goes. We flush the toilet. We've got no idea where that goes. So we're literally just consumers now. We don't have any...
Once the bins leave my doorstep, I have no idea what happens next.
Well, you wouldn't do. And you'd have to actually work very hard to find out where the stuff comes from. So that means we don't have a sense of responsibility. And again, the smaller things are, the more you produce for yourself, the easier it is to kind of take responsibility in that way. But it's very hard to know what to do about that, given that we're living in this enormous interlinked system that it's difficult to escape from.
There is this kind of authoritarian attitude, and it happens in the Green Party, it happens in the Labour Party, it happens in the Conservative Party now. Theresa May is incredibly authoritarian. And there is this idea that we know better than you do. It's a kind of arrogance. We're taxing you a lot because we know how to spend your money better than you do. We're regulating a lot because we know how to behave better than you do, and so on. So what you describe as a kind of middle class thing, I describe as a kind of arrogance, not necessarily a class thing, but just a kind of educated arrogance.
Yeah, well, I think we can talk about Leopold Kohr again, actually,
okay,
because this is very interesting, because in the Breakdown of Nations, one of the cases he makes, and it's a case that's been made by all sorts of other people, from Schumacher to G.K. Chesterton to all sorts of others, is that the major reason to limit power in any agglomeration of power, whether it's economic or political, is that as soon as there's a huge unit of power, somebody will take it over and abuse it and start using it for their own ends. So if the amount of power that any person or group of people can have is limited, then there's only so much abuse of power that people can have, and it's also possible to make it accountable. So if you're talking about an institution like the British government, which is governing 60 million people, it's almost impossible to make them accountable for what they do. You can't really reach them, which is even more the case, of course, in the case of the European Union, which is why I wanted to leave it. It's impossible really to influence them. Whereas if you're living in a town and the town is governed by local politicians, you have a means of influencing them. Just because there are fewer of you and they're there down the road and you might know them.
You can pass them on the way to the tube in the morning.
And you can influence what they do, and to some extent that's true of an MP as well, perhaps. But it's certainly not true of a government that's that big, and so they can have that level of authoritarian power and influence, because there's nothing you can do except wait 5 years and maybe vote against them in an election, depending on what seat you're in. So again, the smaller power, the closer to the ground power becomes, and the smaller the units of power are, in my view, economic or political, the easier it is for people to get control over them and to have a say in how their actual lives are run. A lot of it comes down to scale, I think. If you reach behind you, Paul, on there, you'll see a blue map of England there, on that picture there. Grab that picture, up, that one there, pick that and take it down. Okay. And let's have a look at it. Right, now what you see here, I'm going to hold it up here, and I'll hold it up. This is a map of England, and it's a picture I drew once upon a time, Fixing Britain by Breaking Up Britain, a template. And I've kind of divided Britain into something like the old Anglo-Saxon heptarchy. So we've got Cornwall here, Wessex, London and the home counties, Anglia, Mercia. I've put that area, Scousers and football players. And we've got Wales broken up. We've got Ireland broken up into the four kingdoms, Scotland broken up into Pictland, Inverness-shire, and so on. That would make, imagine it, are you in favour of a kind of, the idea of no longer Great Britain or the United Kingdom of Britain and Ireland, but small individual city-states within Britain? It would be terrific, as long as they were emerging rather than being imposed from above. I mean, that would be the difference. Of course, the EU has already broken up England into 8 chunky regions which bear no resemblance to kind of history or place, which a lot of people are unhappy
Or the
about.
Pennines, for example, which divide England quite naturally.
Yeah, but I mean, these kind of things sort of naturally emerge anyway, don't they? I mean, this is why I also think, having voted to leave the EU, that it would be good to break up the UK. I mean, start with England, Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, and then see how much further down it goes. The Cornish, some people in Cornwall would like their own. Like their own nation, which would be great.
I mean, Cornwall is the most overlooked part of the UK consistently through history. It is so overlooked.
Well, this I think is, if you look back through human history, I think you see that for 99% of history, this is how people have actually governed themselves in very small ways, in regions and in, as you said, in city-states and in villages And even nominally, say throughout the Middle Ages, when England was a centralised families. I mean, look, through the Middle Ages, England is nominally a centralised kingdom, but the king has very little power over most people's lives. I mean, they have to pay a tax. Occasionally, they might get called up to the army. The local lord will have some power over the people, obviously, because especially under the feudal system. But the central government doesn't have much power over the day-to-day running of people's lives. That kind of power is held at village level. And however unjust medieval villages might have been, there's a decentralisation which was necessary because the technology wasn't available. This is another issue. The more technology becomes sophisticated, the easier it is to control huge amounts of people from quite a centralised place.
Yes, technology is weird because on the one hand, things like YouTube and whatever, Twitter or, they've given, or Amazon, they've given people great autonomy. Suddenly I can publish my own book, I can be my own broadcast channel. You are watching my own broadcast channel now. But at the same time, a little slice of the money that my channel makes or the profits that I make their way to Silicon Valley.
Yeah, and you're being monitored all the time.
And I'm being monitored, and if Twitter decides that what I tweet is not appropriate, it can delete it, and so on and so forth.
And you're constantly being harvested. All of your activity is being harvested and turned into an algorithm.
So Google is our feudal overlord.
Well, it is, actually. Yeah, I mean, the incredible thing that they've managed to do, Google and Facebook and all these other corporations, is they've managed to get you to voluntarily give them all of your private information about what you like doing and your tastes and your politics just by posting it all up there. It's incredible. But
they've created a currency that didn't previously exist. Like that the value of that data. I mean, on the one hand, they're taking control of it, but on the other hand, they are creating a new value that didn't previously exist. That your habits were of no...
Exactly, but they are now.
Well, I don't think they knew they were doing that when they started.
Well,
it's one of these things, it kind of happened.
Two classic dystopian novels of the 20th century, right?
Okay.
So you've got 1984 by George Orwell, and you've got Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. And Orwell's dystopia is a dystopia of force, right? So he has this notion that the future is a boot stamping on a human face forever. And it's very much inspired by Stalinism and by fascism, because he was writing at a time when these centralised dictators were marching across Europe and Asia and forcing everyone into a certain way of living. Huxley's is a more subtle dystopia, because in Huxley's dystopia, people don't know they're in a dystopia, and they're controlled by pleasure. So they don't have the notion that a central government is the boot stamping on their face. They're not controlled by punishment. They're controlled by pleasure. They're given drugs. They're given television. They think they're free, but they're not free. And Huxley's has always been a much more convincing dystopia to me, because if you know you're under a dictatorship, one day you're going to throw it off because you know you're not free. On the other hand, if you think you are free and you're giving all your information to Facebook and getting lots of fun and exchange, and you think actually you're living in a consumer paradise, but in reality you're just a drone, you're fuel in the system, then you have no incentive ever to get free because you don't know you're not. And that looks like a much more convincing notion of where we're going in terms of human freedom.
The illusion of democracy, the illusion of freedom.
The illusion that technology gives you freedom as well, because it can do. But as you say, look what happened to the internet, the way that the internet has been gradually controlled by governments over the past 10 or 15 years, something that originally was completely...
And controlled by doctrine as well. This very kind of authoritarian, this is the moral right, this is the moral wrong, and if you breach the moral right, you are not allowed to post on Facebook or we will censor you. So it's not necessarily controlled by governments, but controlled by doctrine.
Well, it's both, really, isn't it? I mean, the doctrine is the sort of the authoritarianism of society in terms of that sort of, I suppose you might call it, PC speech control is getting more intense all the time in the West. But a lot of that's been built up by people using social media, because social media makes it really easy to form mobs. So, it's very, very easy to find a victim, form a mob, descend upon them, attack them until they apologise, and then kind of move on like a swarm, which is happening a lot now.
Oh my God! The internet has given rise to the mob in a way that, yeah.
Well, it's all it's done is it's allowed people who used to form mobs on the streets to now form mobs online, because humans like forming mobs. We always have done. We like forming mobs. We like being righteous. We like attacking the enemy, and social media is just perfect for that. And it just, one of the reasons I used to have a Twitter account and I don't have one anymore, and that one of the reasons is that it's impossible to say anything nuanced or thoughtful in 140 characters. And it's very easy to make enemies, and it's very easy to argue.
Yeah.
And it's actually antithetical to kind of thoughtfulness and thinking and actual good human connection. It's the opposite.
This is one of the dilemmas I face as somebody who is, looking to get on in the media. And that is that, on the one hand, I think, if I say something that's too... Like, my editor at Money Week once said this to me, and it always had great resonance with me, is that when you rant, all you do is confirm the biases of those who already agree with you. Whereas you alienate the undecided. And so I've always made the target of my writings, I've been trying, rather than confirm the biases of those who agree with me, I've always tried to persuade the undecided. So I've always tried to take a very measured approach. I've also thought that if I'm too outspoken or too bold in what I say, I won't get work. It'll lose me bookings here and there and so on. So I've always taken this measured approach. And then I look at the world and it's the people who, create a storm in a china shop. What am I, the loudmouths, from Owen Jones to Nigel Farage, these kind of people who just go in all guns blazing. They're the ones who get the profile, not the measured intermediaries.
That's how the media works, you see. So instead of, I'm not interested in having a media profile. I used to be when I was younger, but
you are interested in selling lots of books and becoming a great intellectual thought leader.
About that, no, I don't want to be a thought leader. No, I just want to find out what the truth is, and I want to explore it actually. And I would certainly like to sell books, but I have no interest in being a thought leader or famous in the media or any of that stuff. Because actually, precisely because, as you said, as soon as that happens to you, you become a caricature. You get the most attention by being extreme. You get the most attention by taking a position against other people and by fighting, and that stuff is actually antithetical to finding out what's going on. I mean, do you want to find out what the truth is and explore it, or do you want to have a career based on, as you say, being a loudmouthed, divisive, charismatic leader? Because they're not the same thing. I
want to find out what the truth is, but I also want acclaim, praise, money, all these things.
That's all writers want that, don't they? Yes. There is that. Yeah, there is that. But I think the media is just poisonous, actually. It's very... the other thing that happens, and I've seen this happen to people a lot, is that you get yourself kind of backed into a corner. You might start writing opinions for the media, you get noticed, then you get a following. Your following wants you to confirm their opinions all the time. They want you to tell them what they want to hear. And you do that because that kind of makes you more famous and you sort of believe it. And then at some point you find you've got, 1 million followers on Twitter, but they're all following you because they want you to keep saying the same thing forever. It's like going to a Bob Dylan concert and constantly wanting him to play the same songs. And then you're backed into a corner. Then it's very hard for you to think your way out of that and say, well, I've kind of changed my mind on that. Actually, I think this now. I've evolved. Because then your followers start falling away and going off to somebody else. So you're
inconsistent.
Well, it's a trap. If you want to be a great charismatic media figure, then you have to it's a brand. You have to brand yourself, don't you? And then keep doing the same thing forever, and it's terrible. No, I can't. I have trouble with that.
I want to go back to one thing we were talking about a moment ago, and then I want to investigate this question of what is the truth. I'm interested in finding out what is the truth. But I'm just working on something at the moment that involves the ancient Greeks and the philosophy of the ancient Greeks, and they were in pursuit of truth and beauty. Beauty is truth. It wasn't the ancient Greeks; it was Keats. But talking about ancient Greece, so let's crack on with that. Where are you now in your research into the truth? How much of the sand have you pulled away to reveal the true sculpture within?
Yeah, well, I suppose where I am is interrogating myself at the moment. Actually, that's what I find quite interesting, because the more you explore the world and the more you interrogate the world, you realise that everything you see is seen through the filter of you. Your neighbour might look at exactly the same thing out of the window there and see something completely different, and that's all formed by your history, your psychology, your opinions, your prejudices. So if you don't know what you're bringing to the conversation, then you don't really know the difference between the truth that's out there and the truth that's in here. And the human brain largely works on pattern recognition. So when we look out, we don't see what's out there, we see what the brain has filtered through to us based on what we've seen before, which means we all back up our own prejudices all the time. So I seem to spend quite a lot of time in my writing at the moment, especially in these essays, actually just looking at how I as a person relate to this and why I might think about it in those ways, rather than imagining that I can come to some objective conclusion about what the world's like, because I'm not sure I can, which makes everything much trickier, of course, because it would be nice to think that you could look out there and work out the truth and then write it down and have a manifesto and then everyone could follow it, but it doesn't really work like that. Because if it did, we'd have solved all the world's problems. Because the world is full of manifestos written by intellectual thought leaders who think they've got a plan. But it doesn't really work. So, yeah.
Well, my plan is that there is no plan.
And I think that plan, that's a good plan.
And that's, you know, that's the anarchists' plan, but it's also the free marketeers' plan. Now, the word free market has an evil, it's Thatcherite, it's exploitative. Well, it is, but it is also free and unplanned, and it happens from the bottom up, not from the top down.
Well, I wonder if you can have a genuine free market. In fact, I'm sure you can't have a genuine free market when you have corporations and financial institutions that are as big as they are now. Because
no, you can't.
Obviously, they're going to dominate it. So in order to have any kind of genuine free market, you'd have to break them all up into small pieces, wouldn't you?
No, you wouldn't. The reason these organisations grow so big, there's all sorts of reasons, but two key reasons are that regulation suits them. The more regulation there is, the more barriers there are to entry. And so regulation tends to reinforce monopoly rather than leave it open to competition. So regulation actually suits the large corporations. There are all sorts of other reasons. Another key reason is our system of money, which is a form of regulation itself. But, you know, once upon a time we used gold or silver or whale's teeth or whatever it is, and money was free. And whatever you and I decide to use as money, we decide between us. But because of government now, money is now money by government edict. So we have to use government money. And the only bodies that have the power to create this money are government, central banks, and large banks. Most money is created when loans are made. That's how money gets created. So the system of money effectively reinforces the monopoly of the large. So if I was to go, what's the zero patient? You know, how do we change it all? The zero patient is money.
Okay, so let me ask you a question.
Okay.
As an environmentalist, okay, so most of my work has been primarily concerned with the mass destruction of nature by humans. Right? This is what's happening at the moment: climate change, mass extinction. We know all the horrible figures. The destruction of the rate of something like the Amazon forest, for example. Now, if it is very, very profitable indeed, which it is at the moment, to level the forests of Southeast Asia, which are primary forests full of wildlife, and replace them with palm plantations, because everyone in the West is building palm oil. And that's what's happening.
Yes, but the palm oil, again... the reason that there's this obsession with palm oil is that all these alternative forms of energy are subsidised. You know, the whole palm oil market is a failure of subsidy in the West. It's created...
Still consuming something, right?
Sure.
So there's 2 billion middle-class consumers in the world. There's going to be 5 billion by the year 2030. And they're all going to want to consume things. So they're going to want toilet paper made out of forests, and they're going to want the fish from the sea, and they're going to want, even if they don't have palm oil, they're going to be consuming things from vast factory farms. And it's always cheaper to run a vast factory farm than, say, a small free-range farm in terms of global distribution.
Well, yes and no. Yes and no, because now, as we get richer, people are demanding, you know, to know the provenance of the cow that they eat for their Sunday lunch and all this kind of thing. So there's a return to the small. That is slowly happening.
I'm not sure they are in China.
No, they're not, but they're not as rich as we are yet, and they're not as sophisticated as we are. The person you need to have this argument with is Matt Ridley.
Oh my God! Right, not Matt Ridley.
Okay, but that's the person you need to have. Because
here's what I would say about this: is that again, I think it's about scale again, because at a small scale, I agree with you. Free markets are good if they can't get too big and dominant. But a corporation like a government, as soon as it outgrows a size where it can be affected by people who can actually see what it's doing, becomes a tyrant. Which is what's happening.
My narrative is that the greatest rape of the environment is waste. If we were all more efficient, there would be far less waste, and the biggest perpetrator of waste is government and large corporations and unintended consequences of failed regulation. If people are left to their own devices, we're far more efficient.
I don't know. People are not very good at food waste. I mean, how much food are we throwing away?
Half of the food that we eat, or rather half the food that is produced in the West, is thrown away. And most of it is thrown away because it can't be given away because of stupid regulation.
Well,
Food waste in the West is a direct failure of regulation.
what I'd like to do, you see, is you know about Chesterton's Distributism, I would guess.
Go on,
Probably know
tell
a
me.
bit about that. Well, you've got your little map there,
Yeah.
breaking up Britain into smaller chunks
Yeah.
so they can be more self-governing. Now, Chesterton's notion, Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc, they come along at the beginning of the 20th century. They're both these couple of big roly-poly Catholic, slightly radical but also conservative thinkers. And they're trying to steer a middle ground between capitalism, which they don't like because they think that business is too big and it's destroying all the things we've just been talking about, but also the state, particularly communism and socialism, which at the time were very big. And all the intellectuals are very much into communism and socialism as the alternative to capitalism. Chesterton and Belloc see them as two cheeks of the same arse, although that's not their quote, it's mine.
I prefer it though.
But it's a good one. But what they say is, look, these are two gigantist systems which are unaccountable. So Chesterton creates this economic and political theory called distributism, in which everybody, this will interest you because you're talking about breaking up of land, you get all the land in Britain and you divide it between all the people in Britain. Everyone gets a chunk of land.
An acre each.
Maybe. Whatever there is. It'll probably be more than that.
I think there's 65 million people and 65 million acres.
Well, that's perfect then, isn't it? You can live on that. And so effectively what he's doing is breaking down the whole place into tiny chunks of land. And the notion is that at that point everybody becomes a co-owner. And then they're free, right? So you haven't got the system in which you haven't got the winner-takes-all system of global capitalism in which you say, well, the big guys have got there because they earned it so they can do what they like. But neither have you got the top-down state socialist system in which you say, well, the government has taken all the land into its power for your own benefit. You say, well, you break everything up and you give it to everybody equally. And then you see what happens. And under those circumstances, you could have a genuinely free market because the corporations would be small and the trade would be local and people would have some power based on land. And then it gets interesting. I'm not saying it would work or be possible.
Yeah, it is interesting.
In principle, it's much more attractive to me than either of the big systems.
A good book by a chap called Sam Bowman, who's a left-wing economist, called Secrets of the 1%, I think it's called, or something like that. And he looks at the richest people through history, from the kind of robber barons of America, Carnegie and Vanderbilt and all these guys, through to Crassus in ancient Rome. And all these guys, and Bill Gates today, all these guys became superlatively rich by eliminating the competition and making sure that government regulation reinforced their monopolies and eliminated the competition. And anyway, let's move on. But I think that my premise that a free market and anarchism are one and the same thing, you don't agree with, which is fair enough.
Well, like I say, I would if it was a genuine free market and it was on a local scale. But
okay.
But I also always come back to what happens to the unprotected things and the unprotected people. You know, who protects the people who will just not be able to afford to live under a free market system? Who protects
we'll all be richer.
forests?
We'll all be richer.
Well, that's very utopian of you.
Yeah.
But is it good to be richer? There's another question.
Well, we'll be richer in mind, body and soul.
Well, that sounds like a utopia. Well, I'm looking forward to it. I hope it happens.
I can't, not at the moment.
Looking forward to your plan for it.
Not unless Dominic Frisby takes hold of the system of tax, of HMRC. Right. Let's talk about your book now. Well, actually, before we talk about your book, I want to talk about an article you wrote in the Guardian, and this is what one of my pet hates is the unequal distribution of land, and this is a global problem. But let's talk about it specifically to the UK. The unequal distribution of land in the UK. And there's ridiculous numbers, and you cite the same guy I do, Kevin Cahill, who's the big expert on this. You know, more than 70% of land in the UK is owned by fewer than 6,000 people. And like we said earlier, there's enough for an acre each. And this is a monopoly that goes all the way back to William the Conqueror. So I wonder if you can, and you wrote about this, of this kind of the corruption of land ownership following the Norman conquest. I wonder if you talk a little bit about that and how Anglo-Saxon England was kind of much more distributed. A mosaic of landowners, you described it.
This is one of the things I discovered when I was researching The Wake, this book set in the aftermath of the Norman conquest, is that a lot of, actually, much of the feudal system, but also much of the unequal land ownership that we've got now stems from the 1066 invasion. So what happens in 1066 is that William, the Duke of Normandy, decides he thinks he has a claim to the throne of England. And he tries to persuade other Norman dukes to come with him, and most of them refuse to come with him. They say, we're not invading England, it's ludicrous, you can't possibly win, it's big, you're a tiny little dukedom, give it a rest, we're not doing it. The only way he can get a proper invading army together is by promising them spoils if they win. He says to them, look, it's basically a pirate army, so he basically says, look, it's a long shot, lads, but if you win, we've got the whole country, and you can just have bloody great bits of it, I'll give you enormous amounts of land. We're gonna tear it up between ourselves. And that's how he manages to get an army of people drawn from across Europe. I mean, from Normandy, but also from Brittany, people from Italy, other parts of France, joining him in on this pirate raid. You have to remember that the Normans are actually Vikings. The word Norman is distortion of Northmen, and it's only a few generations since William's ancestor has settled in Normandy.
So raiding has always been their way.
They've still got a Viking raiding mentality, so they go over to England, and it's effectively the last Viking invasion of England. What happens in 1066, and it's successful. And in Anglo-Saxon England, what you have is a society which certainly isn't equal. It's still feudal in some ways. You still have a king, and you have earls, and they have very large land ownings. But there's nobody who owns everything. The earls own land. Underneath them, then the thanes at local level, the local landlords own land, and peasants own some land as well, depending on whereabouts in the country they are. There's also slavery at the bottom of the system, so it's not any kind of utopia, but it's better distributed. On a side matter, by the way, women in Anglo-Saxon England have far more rights than they end up with for the next 1,000 years under the Normans. The notion that a wife is a man's property, which was only abolished in Victorian times, is a Norman notion. Because under the Normans, women become property as well as land. So anyway, long story short, obviously William wins, and the first law he puts in place in 1067, after he's crowned, is a law that says, henceforth all of the land in England is owned by the crown. So everybody else who has land from now on only has it on sufferance from the king or the queen. And that's still the case now. It's still the case now. If you own this house, I don't know if you do, but if you do...
I don't, unfortunately.
You wouldn't
Out
anyway.
of principle.
You wouldn't anyway.
I refuse to pay these extortionate prices.
This is why they're called tenancies, even if you buy them, because you're a tenant of the queen, a tenant of the king. And in theory, although it's unlikely to happen, they could reclaim their land if you were a disloyal subject. So what William does is he says, everything in this kingdom now belongs to me, and I can distribute it as I will. And what happens over the next 10 years is that virtually every English landowner at high levels is dispossessed and replaced by Normans and Bretons and cronies of the king who helped him to invade. And a lot of those people are still there. I don't know if you saw this great interview with I think it was the Duke of Westminster. He died a few months back, I think.
Last August, yeah.
Yeah, and there was he was interviewed by some business magazine or business paper a few years back by some keen young business journalist, and they interviewed him, and they said, Tell me, sir, what advice would you give to an aspiring young entrepreneur who wanted to emulate your success? And the Duke of Westminster said, well, I would advise them to have an ancestor who was friends with William the Conqueror. He obviously had a sense of humour. But I like that.
He's absolutely right.
That's why he had the land, and that's why a lot of the land is still stitched up, even now. Ancestors of this, it is a fact that if you have Norman descendancy in Britain, then you are more likely to be wealthy in land or financially than if you don't. And that is actually, it's not the full story, but it's the root of this intensely concentrated land ownership in this country, which is the root of all sorts of other problems.
Oh my goodness me. Right, really interesting. Now tell us about the wild men, the Silvatici.
Well, this is what the book turned out to be about. I was in a bookshop in Oxford years ago, and I came across this history book called The English Resistance by a historian called Peter Rex, which is a great book. And it's about the guerrilla campaign of resistance to the Norman conquest, which I'd never heard of. You don't learn about it in school. But it's the equivalent of the French resistance in World War II, or the Viet Cong in Vietnam, or even what's going on in Iraq at the moment, or was against the American invasion. You have very large numbers of people taking to the woods, taking to the fields, and fighting a guerrilla war against the Normans because they're being dispossessed. There's murder, there's slaughter, there's burning, there's land theft. There's a huge campaign of resistance for years, trying to hold off the Normans, and it took the Normans quite a long time to pin down the north of England. They got the southeast under control fairly quickly, but the north and the west down in Cornwall took them much longer. because of this resistance campaign. So yes, they were known by the Normans as the Silvaticae, and all the men of the woods, and the English called themselves the Green Men. And they were there for a long time.
And they became Robin Hood.
Well, it's part of the same
tradition.
It's part of the same tradition, which I think probably starts in 1066. That the rebels are always in the forest. You know, in English history, you've got this giant, powerful crown, and those who rebel against the crown always end up being outlawed, end up in the forest. But then they become heroes of the people. You know, then they become these outlaw heroes. There's a reason that the Green Woods are full of outlaw heroes in English mythology. It's because they're often ordinary people who've been dispossessed and thrown out and demonised, but they're fighting back. So it's just a fascinating period in history which you don't really learn about much.
Right, and and you've written it in a kind of made-up Old English.
The whole book is written perplexingly in this version of Old English. Because I realised I couldn't write. I started writing the book in conventional English and it didn't work, and that because it wasn't the language they would have spoken, and it just felt false. It felt like I was giving them modern technologies or making them drink cappuccinos. So I ended up creating a halfway house language that's somewhere between this English we speak now and the English, the proto-English they would have spoken then. At which point I thought it was impossible that anyone was ever going to publish the book, but I just finished it anyway because I was enjoying it.
Very good, and lo and behold, nominated for a long list for the Booker.
Yeah, you never know what's going to happen.
Now, we're going to talk about your essays in a moment. Your most recent book is Beast, that's your most recent novel, so tell us about Beast.
Well, so I wrote The Wake, and The Wake is set 1,000 years ago, and when I finished writing it, I conceived the curious notion that maybe it could be part of a trilogy that was set, a loosely connected trilogy that was set across 2,000 years of time in England. So the first book set 1,000 years ago, the second one would be set now, and the third one would be set in 1,000 years' time, and they'd be linked by the themes of exploring the notion of place and belonging to place and what that means and what identity is, all the different people moving through this place, how the place changes over a long period of time. And I didn't really know what form that would take, but it was an interesting enough idea to want to do it. So the second book in the trilogy is called Beast, and it's set now on a moor in the West Country. The central character is a descendant of the central character from the first book.
Okay.
Although he doesn't know that, but you do as the reader. And again, it turns out to be about one of the big themes that The Wake is about, which is about the sentience of landscape, the power of places, and what happens when a place begins to control you. You're not just an actor walking through some scenery. You're actually someone having a strange relationship with myth, and what also happens when myth and story and history come bubbling up from the past and kind of wrap their tendrils around your legs. So
great. I don't know. This is just me deluding myself, but I do feel English. You know, when I walk in the English countries, not particularly on the Thames. When I'm on the Thames, on the river, I feel that I'm part of this, and I don't get that feeling elsewhere. I get that feeling in Cornwall as well.
Well, I think it's about landscape. It's funny, I always get that. I always get a strong sense of belonging somewhere when I'm on the Thames as well, because I kind of grew up near the Thames. I think that, if people have identities, which most people do, they're built up of a relationship between a person and the place they're in. If you grow up in a particular place and you have a relationship with that place, then it helps to form you. And that's the fundamental part of being human. And we kind of we've lost more touch with it in living in a giant mega consumer society, which is turning every place into every other place.
Oh God! Don't let's get started on architecture.
Well, I mean, this is what I had this book called Real England, which came out about 10 years ago, and that's exactly what that was about. It was an exploration of how this globalization process, this corporate beast, was homogenising the whole country. I wrote about England because that's where I come from, but it's happening everywhere else in the world too. Every town looks the same as every other town. Yeah. All the pubs disappear, all the local farms disappear, and there are people all over the country fighting to stop it happening. But it's like this steamrolling, homogeneous juggernaut just rolling out this.
The zero patients are money and tax. I'm sure about that. And one day, and bear my witness, I'm going to write a kind of Tolkien-esque novel It's going to be Tolkien meets something else, but and allegorical and all the rest of it. But the Tolkien meets George Orwell, meets Animal Farm.
Okay.
But the zero patient, the thing he has to do is fix tax and fix money and then everything else, and then it solves everything else.
Good luck making that into a gripping plot. If you do, that'll be a great success.
Right, your book that you're out now, and this is the one we want to sell. New Confessions of a Recovering Environmentalist, and this is a compilation of some of your essays, which I'm now turning to the camera and looking down the lens, are brilliant. This is how I kind of started badgering Paul, because I saw the article he wrote in The Guardian about land ownership, and then I went on his website, and then I started reading the essays that are on his website, and I was like, oh, this bloke's great, I've got to meet him. And that's how me emailing him and saying, drop me a line next time you're in London, that's how today this interview happened. But the essays are great. And so tell us about, which one do you want to talk about?
Well, thank you for the plug. It's very nice of you to say so.
Are they the same essays on your website that you've kind of re-edited into a book, or are they different?
And there are some other ones too. I mean, it's a series of essays I've written really over the last 7 years, really about all the subjects we've been talking about, but also, as the title suggests, they're about coming to terms with the fact that the environmental movement I was involved in, I didn't think was working, and it wasn't possible to do the things that we were trying to do. So, as a young idealistic green campaigner, I thought that if we put enough effort in, we could stop the climate from changing, and we could turn around the direction of the destructive industrial juggernaut. And I actually came to the conclusion that we can't do that. I don't think it's possible. I don't think people want us to. I think that all the forces, from growing population to people's desire for consumer goods to the power of corporations to the power of states, is all taking us inevitably towards a direction where we're going to destroy more and more of the natural world until the whole thing falls apart, as it has done so many times before in human history. So that led me to a kind of despairing place for a year or two when I was going, oh God, what do we do now? And I had to write my way out of that. Mm-hmm. I had to get to a point where I thought, well, what can I still do if I believe that? How do I act? How do I write? What still makes sense? What kind of environmentalism is still a good kind? Is still a kind that's worth trying. So really, that's where the book begins, and a lot of the essays in the book I'll start from that point, and then explore from there where we are, what can we still do, what's still useful, and also what's from my point of view, when you give up on big ideas and grand plans, what kind of small things can you do instead? Because a lot of what's happened to me over the last 10 years has been a withdrawal from this notion that it's a good idea, or even a legitimate idea, to have a great big plan for the entire world that everybody ought to be following. Even if that were culturally possible, it's not going to work. No one's going to take it on. If that's the case, at what level can you still effectively do things? Which to me has come down to quite a small personal level, what I can do on the land that I have, and what I can do in my personal life, and what I can do with my writing. So it's actually you take the notion that small is beautiful away from the political arena and take it down to the personal arena as well, and try and do something actually useful and maybe beautiful with your life.
So why did you choose to live in west of Ireland, apart from the fact that it's a beautiful place?
It is a beautiful place, and I had some friends there who were encouraging me to come over and see if it were a good place to live. But I mean, it's part of a process that me and my family have gone through, where we wanted to. My wife used to be a psychiatrist. She wanted to leave that, partly because it was a sort of an impossible thing to do, given the difficulties of working in mental health and in a giant institution, which is what the NHS has become. She wanted to leave. We wanted to homeschool our children. You
homeschool them?
My wife does most of it. I do some of it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
She's
How old are they?
They're 6 and 9.
I'm going to hand you a copy of Life After State when you leave this building.
Okay, I can't wait.
There's a whole chapter on homeschooling.
Oh, great. Okay, well, we do homeschool precisely because, again, it's about that notion of doing things locally, doing things in a small way, teaching your children what you think they should know, and letting them have a lot more time running around in the natural world rather than stuck in a giant building in a town. So we homeschool the kids, and we grow our own food, and we have a couple of acres of land, and we don't have a mortgage, which was one reason to move to Ireland, because it was affordable there. And we were just talking about land ownership, and that's one of the reasons it's almost impossible to buy an affordable house or a piece of land. Can't tell you how many people I know in Britain who would love to have an acre of land.
Oh, I'd love to build my own house and build
their own little house, which ought to be a very cheap and simple thing to do.
Yeah.
And if that were possible,
and it would be so much better for the economy, because there would be less debt and there would be more money in people's pockets, and so they would no longer be slave to pay their mortgages, and you'd get your environmental.
Yeah, it will also be better. It would also be better for the rural economy, which is virtually dead. I mean, if you want to rejuvenate the countryside, make it easier for people to afford to buy a little bit of land, build a genuinely ecological house on it, and then work on it and sell the produce, which is all of this is so hard to do. It's so bureaucratic and so expensive now. It's an exodus. People are being stuck in houses.
So how much did you build your own house? Or
we didn't build our own house, no. That's the bit we haven't done. I've built a tree house for my kids, so you've got to start somewhere.
Oh, great.
But no, it's really just wanting to get back to a simple and more controllable way of life, where you're closer to nature, you're growing as much of your own food as you can, and you have some sort of measure of control again. That's how it feels anyway. And it's also it's also running away. It's also an escape from giant cities. And
how many hours a day do you write?
And it depends on the day, actually. I mean, on a good day, I'll write all morning and then spend the afternoon doing other things, whether it's emails or planting potatoes. But it depends. It depends, actually. At the moment, I'm writing a book which is coming a lot more spontaneously than a lot of my books are, and I'm finding I can't really plan it. And I'm finding also that I'm writing it at night, so sometimes I'll sit up for 3 hours and just write, and other days I won't do anything.
Okay.
I've learned not to force it, actually. That's one of the things I've learned over the years, that you can't, or I can't, set yourself 4 hours a day where you have to be writing. Some days you just can't do anything, and other days it will come pouring out. And you just have to...
And you don't beat yourself up on a bad day.
No, you can't, because you can't make it come if it doesn't want to come. It's like trying to make a seed grow. It will either grow or it won't. You can't force it out of the ground.
Paul, thank you so much for coming over. It's been a real pleasure talking to you, meeting you, and literally, I mean, we had some pretty heavy conversations, and given we'd only known each other for 5 minutes, it's healthy.
I enjoyed it.
That's one of the beauties of podcasting and recording interviews, is it kind of heightens the conversation.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thanks for asking me. It's been good.
Why don't you look down the lens, and the lens is here,
hello,
and plug. Tell us how we can buy Confessions of a Recovering Environmentalist.
I hate selling my work, but yes, I've got an essay collection. It's called Confessions of a Recovering Environmentalist. It's published by Faber. It's being sold in all good bookshops and all over the internet, as usual. And I would encourage you to buy it in an independent local bookshop if you possibly can.
And what is your website?
It's paulkingsnorth.net, and there's plenty more about it on there.
Paul Kingsnorth, thank you very much.
Thank you.